All right, my name is Esteban. Title of my talk is called Ducky-in-the-Middle, Injecting Keystrokes into Plaintext Protocols. So I work as a penetration tester for a company called Coalfire. We do all sorts of security stuff. I blog and do some security research on my own. So basically what this talk is about, so the title itself is a reference to the USB rubber ducky, which is a pen test tool that I'll show in a video. And the whole focus is on exploiting applications that can do two things. So they can send keystrokes to a machine as part of the protocol, and also that they aren't protected with any sort of encryption. And this research began for me just with curiosity of how some of these applications worked. So I wanted to dig into them a little bit. So if you've never seen a USB rubber ducky, this is it right here. So you have like, let's see, is video playing? Let's see. Nope. Let's see. There we go. So it's a little USB thing. You plug it in. It emulates a keyboard, and then you can just open the command prompt. This right here is a Metasploit web delivery payload, but you could basically do anything that you could do with a keyboard. So when it comes to analyzing protocols, you don't really need a lot of tools to do this. You can pretty much use Wireshark most of the time, and for my analysis, I use mostly Wireshark. If you haven't used Wireshark before, it's a protocol analyzer, and you can do deep inspection of a bunch of different protocols. It has parsers for all sorts of things. You can capture and analyze live, or you can do it from a PCAP or a packet capture that's already saved to disk. It runs on Linux, Windows, Mac. You can do lots of filtering, and it's totally free. So if you haven't seen Wireshark, here it is. Top, you have the packets. Middle, you have the breakdown of the different headers. And then you have the raw bytes at the bottom. So the first concept that we need to understand is TCP Session hijacking, which is basically taking over an existing TCP session. And in order to do that, to take over a TCP session, you need to know what the sequence number is. And most of the time nowadays, this is completely random, but a long time ago it wasn't. And if you've ever read about the Mitnick attack, where he used TCP hijacking to compromise the system of one of the people investigating him, it's a really good read, and I would recommend checking that out. But if it's not possible to just guess the number, you can still sniff it if you have a man-in-the-middle position. So there's a lot of different ways that you can get man-in-the-middle, but ARP spoofing is probably the most simple and common one. I think I lost video.
Yeah, you're fine.
Okay. So TCP hijacking has been around for a while. It's been around basically as long as TCP has. There's some older tools that can facilitate this, like Hijack and Hunt are some of the ones I found. And TCP hijacking can't really be prevented if the attacker has man-in-the-middle, but you can stop the impact from it by encrypting the data that's being communicated, or just using a message digest or hashing for integrity checks. So right here, here's a demo. It's kind of busy, but this is a TCP hijacking attack. On the right, I have a telnet client. On the left, I have a telnet server. In the middle, I have Kali Linux, which is the man-in-the-middle. Ettercap running it on the top for the ARP spoofing. And at the bottom is Hunt for the TCP hijacking. So all the action, so to speak, happens down at the bottom. So I have man-in-the-middle, and I'm kind of messing around here for a second, but you can't read the text, but it will say you've taken over the connection. And once I take over that connection, I'll be able to start typing into the Kali system, and those commands will then be sent to the telnet server. So I basically jump in the middle of this existing connection, and then I can start modifying files on the telnet server. So if you look all the way to the left, in the temp directory in the file explorer, I just created a temporary file. And I did that just by jumping in the middle of an existing connection without breaking it. So TCP hijacking is pretty cool, but when you're attacking something, most of the time you don't really need to use this technique because there's easier techniques available. For example, like Telnet, it's much easier just to sniff out the Telnet credentials than it is to actually perform a TCP hijack. and then also you can get the real client and server out of sync, and then it will break their connection. So all the protocols I'm going to talk about from here on, they can be TCP hijacked, but I'm going to attack them in other ways other than TCP hijacking. So the first one is VNC. You've probably heard of it, probably used it, and you use it to remotely control another computer. It uses this protocol called RFB, which is pretty old and doesn't have any encryption built in. The authentication scheme uses DES, which is a very old and deprecated cipher. And also the passwords are typically truncated to 8 characters. And what that means for us is that if you're brute forcing this, you will pretty much find any key regardless of what it is, just because the key space and cipher are very small. So VNC, when the server is running, it has a password file to connect to it. This password is also encrypted with DES, but it doesn't even matter that it's encrypted at all, because all of these VNC passwords are encrypted with the same static key. So if you just look in the source code of many of these VNC clients, you can get that static key and you can decrypt the password if you can access it, either in the registry or on the file system. So this is what a VNC stream looks like on the wire. So this is Wireshark. At the top, you can see the protocol negotiation. The server will send a challenge. The client will send a response, which is both based off of the password. And then once the connection starts, you can start sending keystrokes or mouse movements or screen updates. So here I have some keystrokes, and you can very easily see it. It says test, and if you look at the bytes, they're actually just regular old ASCII. So it's just from Wireshark. You don't have to do anything fancy to sniff out the keystrokes. So there's a couple other tools if you don't want to use Wireshark. There's this one called VNC Keylogger. You can just run it against a PCAP, and it will just extract all the keystrokes. There's another tool called FOSS. For VNC cracking, like I said before, DES, 8 characters, you can pretty much always crack it. There's a tool called VNC Crack that's pretty fast. Can Enable can sniff and crack these handshakes as well, which is another really old tool that you can run on Windows. So once you are able to crack this handshake, you'll get the plaintext password, and then you can just connect to VNC and just control the screen remotely. But if you don't want to go and start moving the mouse around and clicking on stuff, you can use Metasploit to perform an attack very similar to what a USB rubber ducky does. And it'll open the command prompt and start entering keystrokes. So right here I have on the left a Windows 7 box, and on the right Kali Linux running Metasploit. And when I run this module, you'll see, I think it's going. There we go. So we run it. It opens the command prompt, starts putting in text super fast, and then you'll see a interpreter shell pop back on the Kali Linux box. So probably about 2 seconds, you can use that to pop a shell. The next application I want to talk about is called HippoRemote. So this is something that I came across as a Mac user, and it was a tool that you could use your iPhone and basically turn it into a trackpad. Or you could use it as like an external keyboard as well. It also boasted features like being a password manager. It was really popular. Right now it looks like it's no longer maintained, but there was like quite a few downloads when I downloaded it. So here's a little video of how it works. I'm just going to skip it for time. But so when it comes to the implementation on Windows, you're basically just using a VNC client that's forked off of Ultra VNC. And if you're using it on Linux, it's you just use whatever VNC version you have on Linux. But if you're using it on Mac, it has its own app that they developed called HippoConnect, and that's what I'm going to focus on. So with HippoConnect, it has some problems. So for the password storage, it stores it inside a plist within the launch daemon or launch agent. So on Mac, launch daemons and launch agents are what are used to persistently like run applications when you boot up or log in. And inside that plist, the password is there for the server, but it's not encrypted at all. And what's worse about it is those plist files are completely world readable. So even if you were to log into a Mac with a guest account, which should really have no permissions, you could go read this plist file, get the password, and then when someone else logged in, you could start injecting keystrokes. And the program also runs as root, which I didn't find any like buffer overflow or anything, but that's like a good candidate for some privilege escalation as well. So here's the plist. In red here, there's the relevant portion where it shows the password. So it's super easy that if you can gain access to this file, you can find that password to connect. So just like the protocol itself is pretty much like VNC, uses the same VNC authentication scheme. And you can send keystrokes and mouse movements. So here's the Wireshark TCP stream. You can see JSON here, the server identifying itself, handshake response, and then the keystroke or mouse movements. So right here, I created a tool to exploit this protocol. And the first part I made was to just monitor the keystrokes. So if you have man in the middle between the iPhone and the system, you can start sniffing out the keystrokes as they get sent. So right here, this tool is called Angry Hippo. And we can see the handshake come across the screen, and then we'll start seeing the keystrokes being sent once they start typing on the iPhone keyboard. So the good part is cracking handshakes, because once you get that password, then you can start doing whatever you want, not just sniffing out what the person is doing. So we sniff and we can get the challenge and response. And then once you feed both of those to Angry Hippo with the crack option and supply a word list, it can figure out the plaintext password. I ran this against the ROC word list that comes built into Kali, and it took me about 5 minutes to get through the entire word list. And this is just a single-threaded Python script, so if you use something like VNC Crack and just fed these handshakes in, you could probably crack much faster with it. So pretty much always crackable. So the fun part is once you crack that handshake and then you get the password. And at this point, you no longer need to have that man in the middle position. So I'll use Angry Hippo to start sending keystrokes to my Mac. So on the right, we have Kali, on the left, the Mac, and we're gonna start sending keystrokes to the system. So we'll start up a Netcat listener. We run Angry Hippo. And then real quick, you see a flash. What just happened there was I opened up Spotlight, typed in the terminal, brought up the terminal, put a one-liner for a reverse shell, then closed out of the terminal. So it happens very fast. So if someone were to fall victim to this attack, it's likely that they wouldn't even notice what happened. So here's a slowed down version of it. And you can see once the attack runs, you'll see Spotlight open, terminal being typed out, and then you'll see just a regular one-liner for a reverse shell typed in. It will background the process, and then it closes out the terminal window. So like most things on Mac, they use Bonjour, which is Apple's implementation of the zero config protocol. And it's super useful for all sorts of things, but especially for attackers, because it will broadcast out whatever services are running on that system. So right here, I'm using an application called Bonjour Browser, and I can see that HippoRemote is running, and I can see the host name, the IP, and the port. So if you're worried about this happening to you if you use HippoRemote, you probably don't want to use the VNC option or the HippoRemote app, just because they're all vulnerable to this. The screen sharing functionality in Mac OS is a little bit better because everything's encrypted. But you usually don't have to worry about this now because that Hippo app isn't really maintained anymore, so it's probably just time to stop using it if you did. So the last application I wanted to talk about was Synergy. So Synergy is a bit more popular, and the way it works is it's a mouse and keyboard sharing software. So if you had, say, a Linux box, a Windows box, and a Mac system, you could use the same mouse and keyboard to kind of pan across all of your different screens seamlessly. So it's actually really good software. When I got it, there was 2 versions. There was a basic edition and a pro edition. And what you got when you upgraded to Pro was you got SSL encryption. But the basic didn't have any encryption at all, so that's what I focused on. Since I've done my research on this and released the tool, Synergy now has Synergy 2 with 2 versions that are both encrypted. So I don't know if they knew about my exploit tool, but now if you download the latest version of Synergy, it'll be encrypted either way. That's just kind of a breakdown of some of the changes between the two versions. I'll skip that video. So monitoring keystrokes, very similar to the others. If you've ever used Scapy within Python, it's super easy for packet monitoring and manipulation. So here with just 9 lines, if I'm man in the middle, I can sniff out all the keystrokes that are sent with Synergy. So with hijacking, it's a little bit different than the other ones. The other ones I used a man in the middle attack to capture the handshake and then crack it. But Synergy doesn't use passwords. What it does is the client will actually configure what server they want to talk to. And that's the only real form of authentication. And the client will initiate the communication first with the server, but the server will be the one sending the commands. So they have this functionality built in called autoConfig, which uses Bonjour to basically go out and find a Synergy server. So if you're on the network and you have a malicious server running, it'll just identify that as a Synergy server and automatically connect to it. So here what we're going to do is we have the client on the left, the malicious server in the middle, and then PowerShell Empire running on the right to catch the shell that we're going to pop. So right here we got Empire running. We run the tool, it's called Dissonance. It starts up the rogue Synergy server. The client clicks autoconfig. It'll quickly find the server I have running, and then it'll just start accepting keystroke commands. So right here, command prompt, I start typing characters. This is a one-liner to pop a reverse shell in PowerShell. So we'll see the agent call back on the right there. So there's another way to do it too. So more likely than not, if you actually encounter Synergy on a network, it'll already be associated, a client will already be associated with the server. So for attacking it, we want to basically jump in the middle of that connection. So what we can do is we can assume the IP of the real server. We can ARP spoof the client into thinking that that IP now goes to us. And then whenever a connection in Synergy breaks, it'll automatically try to reestablish that connection. So once a connection breaks, it'll connect back to my malicious server because that's how it's designed to work. So right here we have the client again. We have the real server that has an active connection. And on the right we have the rogue server and the command and control server, which is PowerShell Empire again. So you can't really read the messages, but you'll see I'll sniff Bonjour traffic to find out where the server is, what its IP is, and it'll also sniff out where the client is. So I'll have the IP address of both of those so I know who to spoof. So on the right, I'm just selecting the IP addresses that I found by using Bonjour. This is ifconfig. I assume the IP of the real Synergy server. Then I run an ARP spoof against the client to convince it that I'm the server. And then I will run the dissonance tool with the payload of my choosing. So right now the connection is broken between the two, but as soon as I start this server up, it'll automatically connect and start accepting keystrokes. And again, command prompt, just start spraying keystrokes, and then it pops a reverse shell with PowerShell Empire. So if you like Synergy, because I do like it, I would recommend if you're using Synergy 1 Basic, you should upgrade to Pro or use Synergy 2. Or if you're going, across, networks and you want to use, the basic one, you can just tunnel these over SSH as well. Yeah, but when you use the Pro version, everything is SSL encrypted. And if for some reason someone man-in-the-middles you and puts up a rogue server, it'll notify you that the fingerprint of the server has changed, and you have to accept that. So if you did go and click yes to this warning, you could still get owned. But if you know what you're doing, for the most part, this should give you some notice that you're being attacked. So in conclusion, just unencrypted protocols just aren't good. Don't use them at all. And don't be afraid to do your own research either. So this was just kind of a side project I had in my free time. It didn't take too long to do. So if you're interested in just like picking things apart, I would say go for it. All the tools that I mentioned, the Rogue Synergy server is there on my GitHub, as well as Angry Hippo. Both of these are written in Python. Not a developer, not really much of a programmer, but Python's super easy to use. So if you hadn't gotten into any programming yet, I would say jump into that and have some fun with it. Down on the right is my blog. I talk about a lot of topics related to pen testing and just kind of security research that I do. And that's it. So does anybody have any questions?
So first, second for the love for synergy. Synergy is great. Have you, other than Bonjour being a large difference between the two, have you tried throwing this against Microsoft Analog, Microsoft Word?
You know, yeah, someone brought that up to me the other day. They're like, and I hadn't heard of Mouse Without Borders. I wanted to analyze it and maybe sneak it into this talk, but I didn't have time. But yeah, that's something I wanted to look into. Yeah, very similar type of software. I know I went through a lot of stuff kind of fast, so if you have any questions, just let me know. Or talk to me after if you don't want to ask it publicly or just want to talk about anything. Cool, I guess that's it. Thanks.